Welcome to the GSMC Financial News Podcast, the show that delves into the ups and downs of the stock market, changes in the economy, and news from the worlds of real estate and technology. From breaking news on the New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, or the overseas market, to updates on the bond market, if there's money to be made, we've got you covered.
Welcome. You are listening to the GSMC Financial News Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. My name is Maya, and I will be your host for today. Thank you guys so much for stopping in and taking a listen today. We have a lot of things we want to cover in today's episode, so let's go ahead and get started. So the first story that I would like to go over with you guys is about a very interesting, ambitious group of men who are all related to each other. Two brothers, Victor and Eric, and their father Larry, all by the last name Mandelsons, have grown a company to achieve a 47,500% return. That number is not a joke. We are so impressed by them, and they have done so much with this company. So what do? Heiko started off actually in 1957. It did not start with the Mandelsons. It started with a different owner, but it began in 1957 and went public in 1960. So the company itself has already been around for a long time. Now, when Heiko began, they didn't used to sell everything. They sold only one thing. They specialized in engine combustion chambers. And these engine combustion chambers were designed for airplanes and jet planes. So it was a very specific item that they were focusing on. Now that the Mandelsons have taken over the company, Heiko produces everything. Essentially, any part of the plane that you could identify, Heiko can produce it. They can make seat belts. They can make engine parts. They can make every little thing that goes into the airplane. So it's really expanded their capabilities as a company, and it's expanded their capabilities as far as their reach. So back to the beginning. Victor is the youngest of the two brothers. He's now 52 years old, and he was the one who discovered Heiko, quote unquote, when he was searching for opportunities in the buying game. He had gone to school for this kind of thing and was very interested to get his feet on the ground and start searching for acquisitions and ways that he could make money by purchasing strong companies. He found Heiko and presented it with his brother to their father, Larry. Larry also had a strong background in business and had worked in accounting for some time. So that being said, he sat down and took a look at Heiko, looked at their numbers, looked at their executives, and discovered that the company was in really solid shape. They didn't owe anything. All of their numbers looked really good, but they lacked enthusiasm and motivation when it came to their executives. So the people in charge of the company just really didn't have any skin in the game and were not very interested anymore in helping the company to grow. And it appeared that they were comfortable with just remaining stagnant. So Larry decided that it was a really good opportunity and that this would be the perfect target. So they purchased Heiko for about $3 million. That was not the cost of the company altogether, but they put down $3 million worth of money into Heiko's stock so that they could be majority shareholders. That was in January of 1990. So at that time, Heiko, when they were only selling engine combustion chambers, they were bringing in about $26 million in sales, which is pretty solid. And they sold to Pan Am and Eastern Airlines. But like I said, the Mandelsons really wanted to expand production. After purchasing the company, though, it looked like they had so many things to learn about this business and so many things that they needed to get under their belts before they could start expansion. So, and there were other things put in place, like the Federal Aviation Administration. You have to get approval from them before you can start putting out new products. And they do this on purpose so that not just anyone can enter this industry and start making airplane products. It's a very strictly regulated industry. But these guys believe that they could do it. So Eric, who is the older brother, now 54 years old, learned absolutely everything about the manufacturing process, and he currently oversees production, frequently visits the locations, and ensures that everything is running smoothly. But one of the staples that he puts in place as far as his management is that he absolutely will not cut corners. There is no room for mistakes with them. You cannot produce a product that is faulty. So for him, it's really, really key to ensure that there is absolute perfection when it comes to the quality of production. And I think it was through his ability to stick to his beliefs as far as how to produce a quality product and how to run a company without cutting any corners that allowed them to grow so quickly, because by just 1 year later, by 1991, they had received permission from the FAA to start producing new products. So the second product that they began producing was a tube that's used in jet engines. And from that point on, they just took off. So they started producing, like we said, practically every single element that you could find in an airplane. Another staple of this company is keeping prices low. This is perhaps a surprise and perhaps not. A lot of their competitors, such as Boeing and others, don't necessarily follow the same business model, but HEICO aims to keep their prices very low for their customers. They are strictly keeping their costs between 1/3 and 1/2 of their competition. So I don't know about you, but if I was shopping for something especially that is as pricey as airplane parts, that is very alluring. It's no wonder that they are so competitive. They definitely claim that they do not screw over their customer. That's a really big staple for them. Very important. They have a very strong interest in maintaining a good, stable, honest relationship and a good reputation amongst those others in the industry. Now, as far as their margins, it looks like they are pretty strict about not keeping their margins over about 15%. So if any situation does come up where they are pushing margins a little higher, they are very reluctant to go over 20% on their margins, which is nice. So it kind of shows that they're operating with integrity. And by 2019, following this pattern, they had completed 7 more acquisitions, which just shows their capabilities as businessmen. And they look for other companies that I guess they think resemble themselves, that they feel like they built this company from the ground up, or at least they started it as a small company, and now it is a wildly successful venture. So they look for other people who are like this, who have created a very successful company and built something from the ground up, who started with little means. And the goal with that is to create a more stable flow, or a community of companies, a community of business people who have like-minded ideas and a clear vision as far as how to operate in a business. So another staple for this company that I think is really interesting and very important, especially because they're operating as a family business, is that all of the decisions have to be unanimous in order for them to move forward with the decision. This is so important because if you were to, for example, make a decision with 2 out of the 3 of those men and then move forward with it, with one of those men being left out of the decision, that could cause some very seriously shaky ground and would probably compromise the stability of their management. So the fact that they have this rule implemented for themselves, it shows a lot of how they think, how they are, just prepared for any obstacles coming up in the future, that they don't want to have any shaky ground between the 3 of them when it comes to their business. So that's really good for them. They do divide the labor quite a bit. Like I said, the sons tend to go out and do more work in the field, on the ground, visiting their locations around the world, whereas Larry tends to hang back and do most of the work from the office or at home. And they all intentionally live within 20 minutes of each other and the office, which just shows that they plan ahead of time and are willing to fully dedicate themselves to what they do. So all of this being said, there is plenty of reason. You can see how the company is doing really well. You can see how these three men are doing well, but how are their employees? So I think one of the biggest things that the company tries to do to help their employees is focus on retirement. So they will match 5% of what their employees put into their 401k, but not with money. They will match it with HEICO stock. So if you put in $1,000 of money into your 401k, they will give you $1,000 worth of HEICO stock. Now, this stock has only grown in the past 29 years, every single year. So this is probably an even better investment than cash if the company continues to move forward on the track that it's been moving on. That stock will grow exponentially if they continue in the same path. So that being said, a lot of their employees, especially those who have been around for a long time, have been able to retire as millionaires or even multimillionaires. So congratulations to HEICO and everybody who is part of that team, because it looks like they are doing excellent. We have a commercial break to take really quick, and then when we come back, I want to tell you guys a little bit about the Apple Card. This has come out recently, but it's been around just long enough for people to start to get a grasp on how it works and how their customer service operates, whether or not people actually are finding benefit with the card. So we'll talk about that after the commercial break. Hang tight.
Are you a business owner? Someone interested in the latest news that might affect your business? Then check out the GSMC Business News Podcast, a show dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning business, technology, and the stock market. Get a head start on the day as we keep you updated on the latest goings-on Wall Street, money, jobs, and technology. The GSMC Business News Podcast has you covered.
Welcome back. You are listening to the GSMC Financial News Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. My name is Maya. Thank you so much for listening in today, guys. So I want to talk now a little bit about the Apple Card. This card has been out for quite some time now, not as long as so many other cards, but it's relatively new on the market. But now we have a little bit more consumer reviews, a little bit more of an understanding of what it does and how it operates. So I just want to go over it a little bit and find out if it's worth your time or worth your money. On the Apple website where the Apple Card is advertised, of course, it is advertised as a card that is, quote, created by Apple, not a bank, end quote. I don't know how I feel about this particular aspect of it. I think this is supposed to be a good thing, and it's supposed to appeal to people who don't trust banks maybe, or who haven't had good experiences with other credit cards in the past. So maybe they feel like this is a fresh start, a different opportunity coming from a different entity, and therefore perhaps this slogan is something that appeals to a certain group of people. For me, I think about it in the sense that Apple is still, regardless of not being a bank, still a very large, powerful company, so I don't know how much of a difference it really makes when you're looking at bank versus Apple. So I mean, it's an interesting slogan, but I don't know that it really speaks the right message for me. So one of the things that the Apple Card advertises is that it is the first card that actually encourages you to pay less interest. That's from the Apple website. That's kind of an interesting claim. I don't know that it necessarily encourages you to pay less interest, but it does give you a very upfront idea of how much interest you're paying versus how much you're actually paying towards your debts. There is a little toggle device on your iPhone when you get the Apple Card, and it's in the app. So when you go in to make your payments, you can slide the toggle in order to see how much you would like to pay. You can pay your minimum payment, you can pay your statement balance, you can pay any amount that you would like to pay, but when you select whatever amount you would like, it also lets you know here's how much is going towards your debt and here's how much you're paying in interest. So that transparency is really nice. And I do appreciate the way that it organizes that for you, because most credit cards, when you go in to make a payment, you just submit an amount and trust that it's going where you want it to go. So the video that Apple puts up on the website regarding the Apple Card is actually pretty informative and tells you almost everything you need to know about the card. They advertise that it's simple, transparent, and private. As far as privacy goes, we are trusting that Apple has been a reliable company in the past as far as privacy and security goes. I think that Apple in general has proven to be a relatively secure company. All of their technology is usually put onto a closed system, like with Mac computers. So we have a lot of faith in them as a company regarding security. So I think that's good. Simplicity and transparency also has to do with your tech savviness, I would say, because if you are not handy with an iPhone, or if you're new to a lot of technology, maybe it's not so simple and doesn't appear to be so transparent. So that really depends upon your ability to utilize your own technology. But that being said, if you do understand how to use an iPhone, you have no trouble with it, then it should be a relatively easy thing. You can also see your expenses by week, by month, by category, and they use maps. I really like this. They use maps to show you exactly where the purchases were made. For me, sometimes there are purchases that I will see on my credit card statement or on any of my bank statements, and the name doesn't sound familiar and the date is sometimes off, because sometimes transactions are pending for a day or two. So it's a little confusing to me, and I have to just kind of say, that was probably me. But I love the fact that they put it to you on a map so you can see exactly where that purchase was made. You can also see with this card, one thing that I really like about it is you can see your cashback rewards the same day, every single day. So if you were to use the card, most cards sometimes do maybe like a point system or something like that, where you get cashback rewards, but only on certain increments of time, maybe after a few months or on a yearly end or something like that. But this one is every single day, and you can see, not in a point system, but in an actual dollar amount, how much you've received in cashback rewards. Now, that being said, the cashback rewards on this card are not necessarily the best as far as cashback rewards go. You receive 3% cashback on everything that you buy from Apple, whether it be in the Apple Store or on iTunes or the App Store, anything like that. So any Apple purchases, you get 3% cash back. And some other select merchants, including Uber, Uber Eats, T-Mobile, Duane Reade, Walgreens, and Nike. Then you receive 2% cash back anytime you use the Apple Card with Apple Pay, and 1% cash back if you find a store, website, or app that does not currently accept Apple Pay, and then you use your Apple Card. This one is kind of interesting to me. It's clever. It is. Because if you find a situation like this, you use the Apple Card, you get your 1% cash back, you're also essentially doing their research for them and helping them to expand their reach and just find new leads. If they want to expand to other merchants who could be utilizing Apple Pay, you just found a new merchant for them. So, congratulations. And then let's see. There are also no fees whatsoever on this card. That is sometimes a difficult thing to find. It is one of the few cards on the market that actually lives up to this claim. There are actually no fees on the Apple Card. The interesting thing about the card itself, the physical card, is that the actual card does not have a number on it. That's kind of interesting to me because it is somewhat of a security feature, but it also is just a little bit inconvenient. So if you're in a situation where you need to find your card number or you need to make a purchase like online shopping or something like that, then you have to go into the application, open up the system settings and whatnot, or the account information, and then you can get your card number. So like we kind of talked about earlier, we went over the cashback rewards. I mean, they're decent rewards, but it's really nothing stellar. In the way of cashback, there are other cards that may have quite a bit more in the way of rewards. The U.S. Bank Cash Plus Visa Signature Card, for example, offers 5% cash back in 2 categories if you're choosing on up to $2,000 in combined purchases per quarter, according to CNBC Select. So the categories that you select, those 2 categories, if you were to choose it, you can include electronics. And the electronics category would include the Apple Store in person and online. Therefore, with this other card, you're actually making 5% cash back on Apple purchases, whereas even using the Apple Card, you still are only making 3% cash back on Apple purchases. The other thing about this card is it does not offer any interest-free financing options, so it's not really great for larger purchases. You could compare this to the Chase Freedom Unlimited, which offers 0% APR for the first 15 months from opening an account. So that's a good thing. And then the final thing to just discuss about this card is privacy. We touched on that in the very beginning. But Apple does say that it will not be looking at your transaction data. However, Goldman Sachs does have access to the data for operational purposes, like reviewing for fraudulent activity, etc. But Goldman Sachs is never to sell your data or share your data to any third parties. The one thing to be aware of with this card is if you jailbreak your iPhone, you probably will not be able to utilize or manage the Apple Card. So all of that being said, I feel like we have a relatively good understanding of the Apple Card. I know it's a lot of information coming at you really quickly, but I just was curious about it. And I asked a couple of friends of mine who have utilized the Apple Card, and they have generally positive feedback. I feel like people don't necessarily think of it as anything super outstanding. It's really just a credit card. But I thought it was an interesting thing to review anyways, just because it's something new. It's a credit card being offered by somebody who is not a bank and not a typical credit card company. That being said, Brian Riley, the Director of Credit Advisory Services for the Mercator Advisory Group, says, quote, "We need to keep in mind that this is simply a credit card," end quote. And I think that his review is correct. When we look a little further, nerdwallet.com also quotes, "The Apple Card doesn't so much break new ground as consolidate it," end quote. And that really just refers to the fact that, it is just a credit card. There's nothing about it that's really outstanding, but it does put together a lot of different elements that people are looking for in a card. So it puts together a lot of useful things that people are looking for without necessarily presenting something that's groundbreaking. So there's a little review of the Apple Card. If you were interested or didn't know about it or have been looking for a new credit card, not a bad choice, but also review all of your options. There's a lot of credit cards out there. So when we come back, we want to talk a little bit about the discrepancy between wage increases and the number of jobs that were obtained in 2019. So hang tight. We have a quick commercial break and we'll be right back.
Do you work in the world of marketing and advertising? Are you a media buyer or the owner of an agency? Have you been looking for a podcast to help stay on top of all the goings-on of those worlds? The GSMC Marketing News Podcast is dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning marketing and advertising. Get the latest marketing news, from what major businesses have planned for the coming year to the newest trends in advertising, from podcasts, digital and streaming, to the old standbys of radio, television, and billboards. The GSMC Marketing News Podcast has you covered, whether you're a marketing agent or a business trying to expand your brand.
Welcome back. You are listening to the GSMC Financial News Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. My name is Maya, and I'll be your host for today. Thank you so much, you guys, for sticking around with us today. We just went over a little bit of information about the Apple Card. Hopefully that was interesting or helpful for some of those of you who are perhaps considering the card, have been curious about it, and didn't really know which direction to go or whether or not to trust the elements of the card. So we went over that just to give you a brief rundown on what you might think in regards to the Apple Card. Now I want to talk just briefly about the wage versus job rise discrepancy that went on during 2019. I think this is something that has been very important in the last probably decade or so, would be the importance of jobs and wages, and it's certainly been on everybody's Facebook feed and whatnot for quite some time, so everybody's really on the lookout for this, and it's been a really strong factor as far as our livelihood goes, and it's really at the top of people's lists for a lot of upcoming decisions. So it looks like in 2019, unemployment was actually at its lowest in 50 years. That is since 1969. So exactly 50 years ago, unemployment was at the same low percent as it was in 2019, which is excellent. However, wages did not necessarily rise as unemployment fell. So you would think as people are getting hired, we also have people being promoted, we also have an increase in inflation, all of these things that contribute to a necessity for an increase in wages. However, it looks like in 2019, wage growth was very slow. So just reviewing a couple of statistics and categories that come along with this information. It looks like nearly 100,000 new jobs were added in 19, and we have a lot of reports of numbers from people kind of reporting their status as far as seeking work, wanting new work, etc. So the number of people who were employed in 2019 part-time but wished to be full-time fell from 2018 to 2019 by 507,000 people. That's a pretty impressive number of people. Either they found part-time work that they wanted to keep, or they actually managed to find a full-time position, which is excellent. Then the number of people who wanted a job but could not find one and eventually gave up their efforts in searching for a job fell by 310,000 people. That one I think is probably the strongest number that we see on this scale here, because that is, to me, a representation of the general morale of people as far as employment and opportunity goes, because when you have people who are giving up on finding a job, that's a big deal. I can't imagine being in a position of searching and searching and searching for a job and being so discouraged and so unable to find a position that I gave up looking for work. That must be so discouraging. So I'm very glad that that number fell by 310,000 people. That's excellent. Then we have the number of discouraged workers, people who are currently employed but just don't have the motivation. That number fell by 98,000 people. Now, out of the total population of the United States, that's a pretty small number, but in general, we still have 98,000 people who no longer feel discouraged. So that is very, very good. So this category of people, all of these descriptions that we just went through, they fall into this category called the U6 unemployment rate, which really kind of talks about what people want, not so much the number of jobs, just do you have a job or do you not? It's following more of like, are we meeting what people want to achieve as far as their professional careers? So this category, this unemployment rate, fell by 6.7% in December, which was the lowest percentage that the U6 unemployment rate had seen in 25 years. So a big category that we're looking at as far as employment goes is production and non-supervisory roles. So when we look at production and non-supervisory roles, really what we're looking at is the mass of the workforce in the United States. This is a huge category of people, and it really is the foundation of our country. So the wages for this category for production and non-supervisory roles rose by 3% in December. So we just looked at all of these other numbers as far as these things falling. You know, we have less people discouraged. We have less people who are seeking work because they are finding work. But now we have the rise in the wages, which is 3% in December. So by comparison, wages for production and non-supervisory workers had been at a decade high in October of 2019 at 3.6%. But for some reason, dramatically slowed in just a couple of months to 3% in December. This is actually a pretty significant percentage here when you look at this because, 6% of your salary is a big deal. Overall, in 2019, wages grew by 2.9%, which was the lowest wage growth in a year and a half. The 2018 average wage increase was 3.3%. So this not only contributes to the average salary that's offered when you are offered a new job, but it also contributes to promotions and raises. So Diane Swank is the chief economist at Grant Thornton, and she told the New York Times, quote, "It's easier to get a job than a raise in this economy," end quote. I think that's pretty important, and it's interesting to me when I consider it on a broad scale. Why are we hiring so many people and not offering internal opportunity? I don't know if this is just an overall growth or if it's just a different model of performing, but it's just an interesting thing to consider that we have companies willing to put money into new employees, into full-time versus part-time employees. So we have this drive to bring people into the workforce, but we don't necessarily have the drive to reward those who are currently in the workplace. So we need to kind of balance that out. You might think that this is something that can't go hand in hand. Well, if we're hiring so many people, we can't also be promoting internally. We can't also be offering raises. There's too much going on at once. But that's not necessarily true. In 1969, the last time that unemployment was this low, like we said, 2019 was the lowest since 1969, and they actually had the exact same unemployment rate during those 2 years. And in 1969, the annual wage growth for production and non-supervisory workers was over 6%. So that's more than double the numbers we're currently hitting. Right now we are at 2.9% wage growth. In 1969, with the same unemployment rate, the wage growth was over 6%. So it can be done, but there's just something that we're not doing quite right in the system yet. So we just have to find that correct balance in order to make sure that people are getting jobs, maintaining jobs, finding happiness within their job, and also having the opportunity to improve and grow within their position or within their company. So just wrapping up all of this together, I would say that this kind of suggests a lack of competition between workers, because if everybody is just kind of stagnant with their current salaries, and there's really not a lot of internal growth or a lot of salary increase between workers, then maybe people are just willing to continuously hire, but they're not necessarily increasing their standards, or willing to create more competition between employees. So finally, we'd like to look at just the industries that grew the most in 2019. This does not relate to the wages that grew or did not grow during 2019, but just strictly the number of positions that were added or subtracted to different industries in the past year. So education and health services takes the lead by a long shot, almost double, adding 647,000 jobs to the industry. Now, this does not mean that there were 647,000 jobs added point blank. A lot of these can be people who are changing from one industry to another. So that being said, the number of jobs that were added to this category was 647,000 jobs. Second place job addition would be professional and business services, landing at 397,000 positions added to this industry. Third is leisure and hospitality at 388,000 jobs. Government is at 161,000 jobs added in 2019. And finally, construction at 151,000 jobs added in 2019. There are lots of other industries that continuously added to their jobs, but that's all that I want to go over right now. And then we also want to just discuss the industries that lost positions, people who are leaving these industries. The number one industry that lost jobs in 2019 was mining and logging. In the US, dropped by 21,000 people. And then second to that, at a large jump between the two, utilities lost 2,000 people. And this data comes from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. So that being said, we kind of have an understanding of what's going on in the industry. If you guys have any inference on why maybe this is all going on, that would be very useful. And please feel free to comment or let us know why you think this is going on. And if you have any insight into this, I would love to hear from you guys. So we're going to take another quick commercial break. When we come back, we will talk a little bit about women in the workforce and how they are starting to take over men's position as the dominant force in the workplace. Hang tight and we'll be right back after the commercial.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back. You are listening to the GSMC Financial News Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. Once again, my name is Maya and I'm your host for this show. Thank you so much for listening. And you guys, we just went over a little bit of information about wages in 2019 and how that compares to the job growth, or at least the lack of unemployment. So we have a lack of unemployment, but a little bit of stagnance as far as wage growth goes. And now I want to talk about women in the workplace. It was recently released by the Wall Street Journal that women actually held more jobs in the United States than men as far as December of 2019. And this was going on for the first time in nearly 10 years. So this tells us a lot about the workplace in the United States and who is getting out there and what's going on. So let's look into that just a little bit. So to begin with, it looks like we have to make a clear distinction between where these numbers are coming from. So the numbers of women on payrolls is what we're looking at. Women on payroll have been increasing since about 2010, but this is the first time that women have surpassed men on payroll accounts since 2010. So, and this number is only just a little bit. It looks like the workforce, as far as payroll goes, is 50.04% women. So it's not a huge difference, but it does appear that there are 109,000 more women on payroll than men. And I think this data really can be used as concrete evidence to represent equality or inequality in the workplace. So it looks like we're having a little bit of progress as far as women in the workforce. These numbers have been changing for quite some time, but it looks like progressively but slowly we have been narrowing the gap between men and women, the number of men and women who are working. So where is the change taking place? Primarily education and healthcare. Both of these fields are predominantly female. And this is something that really, if you ask your colleagues, your daughters, your friends, their friends about their experience, This is something that doesn't really take a lot of research to figure it out. Just growing up in school as a female, it's pretty obvious. A lot of my classes, like biology and chemistry, were strongly dominated by females in the classroom, even in college. But there were different sectors like business or computer sciences that were much more held down by men. And if it was one of those classes where you decide, hey, I'm going to delve into this thing, it became almost an awkward situation where people didn't think that it was okay for you to be there, or they thought that it was just strange. But I'm hoping that we'll start to see a little bit more even distribution of women and men in all different fields. Maybe we do need more men in education and healthcare. Maybe we need more women in computer science. So we'll see. But for now, it looks like education and healthcare is really what's bringing in all the women into the workforce. Both education and healthcare together added 36,000 jobs in December alone. And almost, well, not almost all, but a lot of these jobs were women. So that tells us kind of where this growth is coming from. Meanwhile, this is also in reference to the last section we just talked about as far as the growth or lack of growth in different industries. But mining and manufacturing are two industries that are very strongly dominated by men. These lost a combined 21,000 jobs. That is the same exact number that we referred to in the last section, if you remember. So the last time women dominated the workforce was a result of economic recession. In about 2008, when we had the big recession hit, as a result of that, in the following couple of years, certain industries took a big hit from that recession, including construction and manufacturing, which, like we said, are male-dominated workforces. So a lot of men at that time lost their jobs, but because they were so predominantly male in those industries, a lot of women didn't lose their jobs, which means that really the only reason why we saw so many women percentage-wise in the workforce at that time was not because there were women being added to the workforce, but because men were leaving the workforce, not necessarily by choice, but they lost their positions. And so we just saw an influx of women, but it wasn't necessarily a positive change. It was actually a negative change because men were losing their jobs. So at this point, what we're looking at is not necessarily a recession, but more of just a normal standard economy at this point. So now we can infer that the change, the influx of women in the workforce is actually a positive thing, because it doesn't mean that we're losing men, it just means that we're adding women. And overall, we have seen an increase in jobs altogether, just like we talked about in the last section. So it looks like we can kind of take this news to be a good thing. However, I do want to talk about the representation in these numbers, because it's possible that it can be a little bit skewed and that it isn't a perfect representation of really what's going on in the workforce. So that being said, what does that mean? Men are more likely to hold jobs that are not on payroll. So self-employed or doing manual work or running a farm, things like this. Men are more likely to hold these positions, which means that they may not be represented in these numbers. So a different survey from the Labor Department, actually shows that men still represent or account for the majority of the workforce. They're just not necessarily on payroll type jobs. At the same time, women are actually more likely to be working more than one job at a time. And because they are also more likely to work payroll jobs, it's possible that one person, or one woman specifically, is counted more than once, or for, more than one spot on this payroll survey. So even though we see 109,000 more women on the numbers, that doesn't necessarily mean that there are 109,000 more women in the payroll sector. It just means that they're being represented that many times. So if more women are working more than one job, it alters the numbers just a little bit. Nonetheless, I think that just because we are seeing positive changes and we are seeing a lot of people taking on new jobs, we're seeing a less discouragement in the workforce, and we are also seeing a normal economy where people are not consistently being laid off or losing their positions. We can take this as good news overall. So this has been a lovely section to talk about. I like presenting good news for you guys. So We have another commercial break to take real quick, and when we come back, I want to follow up on one of our topics from last week, actually, in regards to financial goals for 2020. We have a little bit more advice from someone more expert than myself. So we'll take a look at a more concrete plan than what we presented last week and see if potentially her advice could help you guys out. So hang tight. After the commercial break, we'll be right back.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America's Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America's Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back. You guys are listening to the GSMC Financial News Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. My name is Maya. So we just went over some news as far as women in the workforce, what those numbers mean to us, how we can interpret it, and generally I want to say that it was positive feedback as far as these polls go, as far as the surveys go. It looks like we are seeing an influx of women in the workforce. That does not imply a lack of men in the workforce, simply an influx of women. So that's all really good things. We have so many women who need to be working and enjoy working, so this is all good news. Now, last week, we went over some information as far as the financial goals that people have set for 2020. It's a start of a new decade, start of a new year. People always have this concept that this is a fresh start and this is the time to start getting my goals in place and start working on myself in one way or another. Some people have fitness goals, some people have spiritual goals, and here we want to focus on the financial goals. So last week we talked about some numbers given to us by Fidelity Investments, and those numbers represented the 2020 resolutions that people had set as far as finance goes. Those resolutions included paying off debt, saving more money, and spending less. And those were the top 3 financial goals that people had. So we talked about a little bit of information and advice as far as how to accomplish those goals and steps that you might take in order to make that happen. So this week, actually, CNBC senior personal finance correspondent Sharon Epperson was featured in an interview in which she discusses more concrete steps to achieve these goals, not specifically referring to those 3 goals, but considering the fact that those were the top 3 financial goals that people had set for 2020, I think that this is kind of what we're looking at, and they all fall into place altogether. So I want to talk about this. She has it laid out in a 2-week plan, I would say, to where week 1, she gives you a sort of assignment, and then week 2, you have a secondary assignment. And by the second week or the end of the second week, you should feel confident that you have some sort of plan in place in order to accomplish your 2020 goals financially. So the first thing that she says for week 1 is that you need to know where you stand. You must first calculate your net worth. This is something we didn't talk about last week. So to calculate your net worth, all you have to do is add up all of your assets and subtract from that your liabilities. So subtract what you owe from what you own. Things that you own might include cash, your car, retirement accounts, anything that you have saved away that is yours. So all of that adds up together to form your assets. Then you have to calculate your liabilities. That could be your mortgage, credit card debt, student loans, any other personal loans that you might have, any debts, anything that you owe. So your positive and then your minus, you put them together, you get your net worth. And you don't have to be a wealthy person to calculate your net worth. This is something that sometimes on a social level, we might think, oh, a net worth only applies to people of a certain status, but that's not true. A net worth applies to everyone, and it is important to know where you stand in order to know how to get where you want to be. So if this number, your net worth, if it's a positive number, then great, good for you. We want to maintain that track. If it's negative, however, Miss Epperson says not to worry about it. If you're negative, it's just your current financial situation. This does not imply that this is going to be your financial future. So that's the reason why we're setting these goals. According to her, and very similar to the numbers we looked at last week, only 2 out of 5 people budget. That, I think I touched on this last week as well. It was surprising to me how few people actually budget in, just in their daily life in order to have a plan as far as where they go. And I think that the lack of budgeting comes from fear. People don't actually want to face their current financial situation, and they a lot of times have concern or worry when it comes to paycheck to paycheck types of finances. If you are living to paycheck, you think, why should I budget? Why should I look at the future of my finances? I feel discouraged already. And all I know is that I just have to make it through this week or make it through this month. And she says that the only way to really get out of this cycle is actually to sit down with yourself, take a real honest look at where you're at, and create a stable budget that's going to help you actually to get out of that paycheck to paycheck cycle. And if you're not living paycheck to paycheck, you still have to have a budget in place in order to ensure that you're moving in a positive direction. You don't want to get stuck in a rut. You don't want to find yourself in a situation that puts you in a bad place. And you always want to have a backup plan and know where you're going in the future. So budgeting is extremely important. She wants you to create a list of all of the income that you have coming in. Write it down. Really, literally write it down. First, write down your essential expenses. So things like car payments, mortgage, rent, etc., taxes that come out of your income. You have to put down all of your essential expenses. Then list your debt payments, anything that you owe that you know that you're going to have to pay. And then you start adding in non-essentials like clothing, entertainment. And for her, she also says to include savings in your non-essential payments or non-essential expenses. So savings is kind of something that you have to work on as a personal goal, but it's not something that you directly owe. It won't hurt you immediately if you don't add to your savings. So what if you're in the red? Like, what if you know that you're living paycheck to paycheck and you're already spacing it out in your head? You have that game kind of going on. Okay, well, my paycheck comes in on this day, but my car payment is due 2 days later, so I'm going to have to stretch this one out in order to make this end meet. And, you're kind of rolling on this cycle of what can I sacrifice and what can I do to make it work in the meantime just to get by. For Miss Epperson, she says this is still okay. You still have to set up a designated way to allocate your money. So she likes to follow something something called the 60% rule, which says 60% of your gross income should go towards committed expenses. Anything that you have on auto pay, anything that you have to pay on a monthly basis, such as rent, things like that. 10% of your gross income should go towards retirement. 10% should go towards long-term savings, such as maybe a college fund or saving for your first home, something like that. 10% should go towards short-term savings, like having an emergency fund. Typically, the staple for the emergency fund is to have 3 months worth of all of your expenses saved up into an emergency fund. And then 10% that's left over from that is your fun money. For Ms. Epperson, she says this might be cut short. Your fun money is honestly on the back burner, even though it is what you want to allocate your money towards every day. You want to buy a beer, you want to go out and go shopping, you want to have a good time with your friends, that's great. But this fun money might be short because you have to be able to prioritize. So this is really similar to what we talked about last week. So since this is a 2-week segment for her. She's got a week 1 challenge and a week 2 challenge. We're going to separate it up like that as well. So week 1, go ahead and work on your budget, work on determining your net worth, and work on allocating your expenses following the 60% rule, and really write it down. Because if you just think about it in your head and you kind of imagine what you're going to do, then you're much less likely to stick to your plan, and you're much less likely to succeed because you don't actually have concrete numbers to follow. So write it down, and we'll start with this for this week. Next week, or in the next episode, we'll talk about week 2's assignment from Miss Epperson so that you guys can follow along and hopefully start to feel a little bit more concrete and more motivated in following your 2020 financial resolutions. So hopefully that was helpful for you guys. We have one last commercial break to take, and when we get back, we'll take a look at what Amazon is doing as far as their partnership with FedEx ground delivery. It looks like that delivery service had been banned from Amazon for a period of time last year, but the ban is soon to be lifted. So hang tight, and we'll be right back after the commercial break.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back. You guys are listening to the GSMC Financial News Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. For the last time today, my name is Maya. So we just went over a couple of different points to note from Sharon Epperson, CNBC Senior Personal Finance Correspondent, and her advice as far as how to meet your goals for 2020 financially. Next week, like I said, we'll follow up with her week 2 points and how you guys can achieve the second half of what her goals are for you. So next, I want to talk about Amazon and their partnership, or rather lack thereof, with FedEx. It looks like during the last month, during December, Amazon had actually put a ban on FedEx's ground delivery for prime shipments. The reason for this was that they had poor delivery performance. So shipments were taking too long. People were having problems with their packages. They had a lot of customer complaints from FedEx's ground delivery service. But lately it looks like they have been able to recover from the mistakes or the poor reviews that they were receiving. It looks like their average transit time during the holidays, during peak season for FedEx, was 2.4 days for ground packages, and 18% of their ground packages were actually delivered early. So because of these good numbers and good news that they were able to provide, they were able to report that back to Amazon and try to get back into their partnership. The ban on the FedEx ground delivery services, ground and home services, was a little bit of a surprise for a lot of their third-party sellers through Amazon, because they were, a lot of them, relying on FedEx or had previously used FedEx for a bulk of their shipments, if not all of their shipments. So when Amazon released the news that they were not allowing this, it took a big hit for their third-party vendors. So they had to kind of find alternative ways to do that. Of course, there are a lot of other ways to send packages, but just the ban on a major ground delivery service causes a little bit of a rift in the vendors' world. So just following the lift of this ban, this temporary suspension, you could say, with FedEx, FedEx, of course, took a little bit of a hit from that. A lot of people didn't know what was going to go on with FedEx and how stable the company was going to be. Obviously, working with Amazon is huge. So when you lose that, it causes a little bit of shaky ground to come up. However, when the ban was lifted, or this temporary restriction was lifted from Amazon's work with FedEx, FedEx benefited from that significantly. And on the very day that the news was announced that FedEx will be allowed to be working with Amazon again, their shares went up by as much as 3% immediately following the release of the news, and ended the day up by 1.8%. So this is really good for FedEx. Not only are they regaining their work with a huge company, but they're also, benefiting in the way of stocks. So looks like FedEx is going to come back to Amazon and will be available as early as Tuesday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. So if you happen to be a vendor who is working through Amazon previously using FedEx, hopefully you already received the email that was sent out from Amazon. But if you were not already aware, now you know you can use FedEx again. And FedEx has benefited pretty significantly from the reconciliation with Amazon. Well, we're out of time for today's episode. I hope you guys have gathered a lot of good information. If you have any feedback for me, I would love to hear from you guys. Feel free to leave a comment on the website and just let us know what you think about the show. And as always, thank you so much for listening to the GSMC Financial News Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review. That really helps us. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you so much, and have a good day.
You've been listening to the GSMC Financial News Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type GSMC into your favorite podcast app to find all of the shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, from business news to weird news. Please subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you've enjoyed today's podcast.